All of it?
Two-thirds of it. Yeah, it didn't go as far, but he said we can't have troops on the ground until there's a political solution. So he put it off this. They said we want to put a coalition involving Russia. Stuff that I want to use if I get on the record and said. We got Paris, where the sea equivalent advisor to Hollande gave a similar thing in Paris, and he said this was on background, so we've got French diplomat from Paris.
Good afternoon, everybody. A couple things here at the top. The United States condemns the horrific bombings on November 17th and 18th in the northern Nigeria cities of Yola and Kano. It killed more than 30 people and injured dozens more. We denounce the callous terrorist acts that have taken place repeatedly in Nigeria and other countries in the Lake Chad Basin and offer our condolences to the victims and their families, of course. Those responsible for these crimes must be held accountable. The United States renews its commitment to work with Nigeria and its neighbors to defeat Boko Haram and to address violent extremism in the region, countering these attacks on our common humanity. On Thailand, we are deeply concerned that Thailand has sent 2 UNHCR-registered Chinese refugees back to China, where they could face harsh treatment, arbitrary detention, and the lack of due process. We join the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in expressing our grave disappointment with this decision by Thai authorities, and we urge Thailand to abide by its international obligations and commitments, as well as its long-standing practice of providing safe haven to vulnerable persons. Finally, the United States welcomes the reopening of the Somali embassy here in Washington, D.C. The opening of the embassy is an important step, we believe, toward normalizing the relationship between our two countries, and we look forward to working closely with the new Somali embassy to bring stability, security, and prosperity to the Somali people. With that, Brad?
Yeah, I think we'll get back to some of those. I just wanted to start with a couple things left over from the Secretary's trip. Firstly, he received quite substantial criticism for comments he made comparing the recent attacks to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I saw your tweet last evening. Can you just say what what the secretary was trying to convey by that
I
statement.
think I'd point you to what he said today in his speech here earlier this morning on the 30th anniversary of OSAC, where he talked about the fact that no act of terrorism is justified, and there can be no rationale for the senseless, indiscriminate killing of innocent people. And he said that in Paris yesterday, and he said it in Paris right after the Hebdo attacks, as a matter of fact. As I said in my tweet last night, all he was simply doing was proffering forth the rationale used by the terrorist in their attempt to justify it, and reflecting, I think, the notion that in the Hebdo attack, not that it's justified, but that they justified it based on a certain act by publishers. That's how they justified it. Whereas the attacks in Paris in just the last few days were not, there was no rationale provided by ISIL for them other than the fact that they're just brutal murderers and indiscriminate killers. So he was simply reflecting the justification that they themselves put on that. That's it. But I think again, he was very, very eloquent and very clear today about the fact that there's no rationale for
He
this
wasn't
kind of violence.
suggested one was worse than the other, or one was more.
Absolutely not. No, and he didn't at the time. If you remember, he went to Paris shortly after the Hebdo attacks and spoke rather forcefully about how devastating and how terrible those attacks were, because they spoke to a larger hatred by groups like ISIL.
And then from the trip, he also said that he believed we were only weeks away, perhaps, from a ceasefire. What does he know that we don't, that leads him to that conclusion? Has the Syrian opposition told him they accept this plan and that they're willing to lay down their arms? Has he heard from Russia or anyone else that the Assad government similarly is ready to stop fighting?
On any given day, I just assume that the secretary knows a lot of things that we don't, certainly things I don't. But he did speak about a general sense that we could be a matter of weeks away from a ceasefire. He caveated that, obviously. That's that we'd like to see it be that soon. And I wouldn't get into, I don't think it'd be wise to get into the details of diplomatic conversations that he's had coming out of Vienna, actually there and then coming out of Vienna, that give him cause to be optimistic about it. But he does feel that in general, and you could see this at the press conference he did in Vienna, that much progress was made, a lot of specificity on the process moving forward for political transition. We talked about the framework of what that could look like, and you saw much of that framework revealed coming out of this last round in Vienna, and he believes that momentum will continue to propel forward. Now, obviously, he also was very honest about the fact that in order for us to be able to get to a ceasefire in a short period of time, there's got to still be a lot of pressure applied. There has to be, that momentum has to be continued, and everybody who has made commitments there in Vienna need to keep those commitments. And again, without getting into the specifics of what gives him reason for that, I can tell you that he continues to believe we can get there. But he'd be the first to tell you that in order to get there, everybody has to maintain the same sense of urgency and pressure that they had on themselves and on each other coming out of Vienna.
Can you lay out the next steps in the process then, how you will get there, how that urgency will be conveyed?
Well, I think he believes everybody does have a common sense of urgency now coming out of Vienna. There needs to be work now at the UN, specifically on the ceasefire, since the UN will be, as stated in the communique, the ceasefire will be UN-sponsored. So there's some work I think that needs to happen at the UN to start to move the process forward. The Secretary, I can tell you, will, in bilateral and multilateral sessions going forward, continue to work through the specifics of how we get to a ceasefire, the physical mechanics of it. I can't lay that out for you right now, but I can tell you that he's working hard on that.
Bringing in the government and the opposition, or choosing, the terrorist groups.
Well, I think
versus
that a
non-terrorist.
large part of that will come from UN leadership, as it should, because in order for the ceasefire to to have the international legitimacy to hold, it's going to have to be UN sponsored. So some of this initial work is really going to be for the UN to pursue. That said, I think you can count on Secretary Kerry to keep his foot on the pedal too, and the pressure applied to all the players to move that process forward. He's not gonna let go of this. But I can't tell you exactly each next step in that process to getting to what we think will be a sustainable ceasefire. And obviously, it's going to require those who have influence on the sides, not just the Assad regime, but the opposition groups. It's going to require those who have influence to exercise that influence diligently, and to hold those, to the degree they can, to hold those parties accountable once a ceasefire is in place, to keep it in place. So it doesn't require just an honest effort by all the sides in the Syrian conflict. It's going to require an honest, diligent effort by all those with influence on those parties. Does that make sense? And that's where a lot of the diplomacy, I think, will come in.
John,
Yeah.
how would be the implementation of Vienna statement different than the implementation of Geneva communique, since the difference between the US and Russia is still there regarding the future of President Assad?
A couple of things on that. I mean, first of all, the Geneva communique really has served as the foundational document for the last two sessions in Vienna and the communiques that came out of them. And the 2012 Geneva communique is still very relevant. In fact, provided the basis, the sort of connective tissue for us to get to the communique of just last week in terms of basic core principles. And implementation is still a work in progress, to be honest with you, Michelle. I mean, there's right now there's a focus, as Brad asked about the ceasefire. I think there's a keen focus now on trying to get at that. The secretary said that all the parties agreed to a target date of January 1st to get negotiations started between the regime and opposition groups. Now, there's a lot of, January 1st is coming. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to help, and we talked about this after Doha, to help unify the opposition groups and to get them in a position where they can sit down and start to have those negotiations. Once that starts, I mean, that's about a 6-month process, as you saw in the communique, to work through building a framework to get to the drafting of a constitution, and then the work continues from there. So the communique coming out of Vienna laid forward very specific milestones and goals tied to timeframes, not dates except for January 1st, and tied to processes. And that's where everybody's focused on right now.
We had two experiences happened in Geneva between the regime and the opposition when they came to the table, and they haven't achieved anything. What's the difference now between the past two experiences and now?
I think the difference is you have, first of all, a much more concerted interest and effort by more international players than you did back in 2012. I mean, there were 20-some participants at the meeting in Vienna last week. There were 10 in 2012. So we've doubled the amount of international participation and international community leadership just in terms of participants. So there's much more effort on this. We've also, in 2012, we weren't dealing with a threat by ISIL inside Syria, which has obviously drastically changed the situation on the ground and has contributed to the flow of refugees out of Syria as well as the violence. And you saw coming out of Vienna, not just this last one, but the one before it, very firm stated commitment by all participants that groups like ISIL and al-Nusra were not going to be part of the ceasefire, and that international efforts to defeat them needed to continue. So their situation is different in Syria than it was in 2012. It is more dire. There is much more international community recognition of those dire circumstances. We didn't have the refugee problem in 2012 that we have right now in Europe. So there is a sense of urgency here that I think has been building over the last couple of years. And I think given that there are more nations now involved and more international organizations, the Arab League was represented, the EU was represented, that there's a renewed sense of energy and effort that's going to be applied on this. I can tell you that the secretary believes, and I think he's joined in this by the other ministers that were represented there, that there is a sense of momentum here, perhaps more so than what we've been able to achieve in the past. And then to your specific questions about, the opposition and the regime, that's why, and this is what, unlike 2012, that's why we've got this process that we laid out last week of working on a target date of January 1st to get the opposition groups properly identified and unified to sit down and have a negotiation with the Assad regime. And we have, post January 1st, you've got a 6-month process there that's laid out for a Syrian-led process to develop the drafting of a constitution. So there's specifics now in terms of what a political framework can look like going forward that we just didn't have in 2012. I can't tell you exactly why things fell apart then. And nobody's, guaranteeing that there's not going to still be obstacles and challenges going forward now. But there is a renewed sense of urgency. There are more specifics now applied. As you look at the communique, you can see it. It is much different than what we were looking at in 2012. And thirdly, there is a much larger consensus of international community support for moving forward. And one of the things that the opposition group said just a few weeks ago, because people were asking, well, why aren't they sitting down now? Why aren't they coming to Vienna? And even they would tell you, or they had, a couple of weeks ago said, we need more international community consensus about moving forward before we're going to be able to start to organize ourselves and move forward. And now you have that momentum now. Now you do have more international community consensus.
Does the Secretary believe that the opposition is fully bought in at the moment, or does he still have to do some work on that?
There's more work to be done on that. I think the Secretary would tell you that, as well as the foreign ministers that were at that meeting. So they all realize that there needs to be more work now. And now's the time. We talked about this a while ago. When? Well, now's the when. Now is the time that that we need to start bringing the opposition groups into the process. But there's still work to be done in terms of, and the Secretary talked about this in Paris, in terms of, getting them separately together at a table to sort through some of their own differences and to unify their own negotiating positions, so that when in early next year, when they sit down with the regime, they've got common unified negotiating principles to take forward.
Do you think you can get that done by January?
Well, the Secretary,
Deadline?
again, said that that's the target date. It wasn't just the Secretary. It was in the communique. All participants set that as a target date. And I would emphasize that it's a target date. And I think we all need to keep that in mind. I mean, that's what we're shooting for. And, could it change? It might, but that's the target date that we're all shooting for.
Are you aware of the opposition meeting in Saudi Arabia next month?
I don't have anything specific to say on that, but as the Secretary pointed out yesterday, that there is going to be a meeting of the opposition groups, and that Saudi Arabia was going to take a leading role in helping fashion that. But I don't have any more detail than that. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
On the other half of the Syria effort, the campaign against Daesh, yesterday, Mark explained that when the Russians launched their attack on Raqqa, you had a warning and were able to keep U.S. personnel safely out of the way, but that it wasn't a coordinated operation in that sense. It was like deconfliction.
Right.
But when the French speak about it and when Vladimir Putin speaks about it, they speak increasingly of cooperation between the French and the Russians. And the French themselves say they're cooperating with America. They're very glad for the intelligence support and so forth. But
Well, they're part of the coalition.
Yeah, they're part of your coalition, but they also now speak more openly about also being in cooperation and with Russia. And Vladimir Putin described the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Moskva and the Charles de Gaulle will soon be, as being in an alliance. Is there a kind of Venn diagram of overlapping coalitions? Do you feel also, I believe the French are calling for a broader coalition?
Well, I'd let the French speak for themselves in terms of what they're calling for. Secretary had a terrific meeting yesterday with President Hollande. They talked a lot about going forward against ISIL in Iraq and in Syria. They talked about France's terrific contributions to the coalition, and the president reiterated what he has said publicly, that they very much intend to intensify their efforts against ISIL in the wake of these deadly attacks. And we certainly welcome additional contributions by France in the coalition. There is a coalition, and it's of 65 nations that has been fashioned over the course of the last year, that the United States has led the way in terms of coordinating and assembling. And that coalition has had, as the Secretary said, progress against ISIL. On Russia, we are not cooperating with Russia militarily against ISIL. What we've said, and I'll repeat it again, that if Russia is serious about going after ISIL and wants to make that their focus, then that's a conversation that we're still willing to have. And neither President Obama nor Secretary Kerry has ruled out the possibility of cooperation in the future if, in fact, that's where Russia wants to take things militarily. Now, we've seen some strikes in the last few days in Al-Raqqa by Russian aircraft in what we consider to be ISIL-dominated areas, and that's welcome. But I think, it's too soon to tell whether this is indicative of a strategy shift by Russia in terms of their military activities in Syria. I mean, actions speak louder than words, and I think, we're just not ready to, make a call right now that would say they've changed their calculus in terms of what they're hitting. You mentioned the prior warning that we had, and that's what it was. It was a notification, military notification that they were going to be conducting these strikes. I would not read from that, nor would I interpret that to indicate some sort of coordination or cooperation militarily at all. It was nothing more than a notification.
On a similar note, the Russians now have said that they're sure that their airliner was brought down by a bomb, probably a Daesh bomb. Mark told us that America was also waiting for the results of the Egyptian inquiry, since they probably presumably have the lead on this. It seems like the Egyptians aren't going to say that.
Well, I'd point you to the Egyptian leadership in Cairo for what they will or they won't
But
say.
will America make a determination if Egypt never gets around to it?
What I can tell you is that we believe, based on information that we have now, that it was likely that Metrojet was brought down by terrorist activity. We do believe that. But I let the Egyptians speak for themselves.
Have you been able to make a determination on the credibility of the specific claims in Dabiq magazine, the ISIS magazine, which they put a photograph of a bomb in a Schweppes can?
Yeah, I've seen those photographs, as I'm sure you have. I don't believe we're in a position right now to authenticate the veracity of that as the bomb and what brought it down. But I mean, but we do believe terrorist activity was likely the reason. Yes, and we have no indications now, no reason to doubt ISIL's claim of responsibility.
Can we go back to the coordination with Russia? The Secretary has said today, in the last few days, we have seen Russia and France increase the bombing level against Raqqa, and we will see greater coordination in this effort. What did he mean by that?
He meant exactly what I just said, that if this represents a change in calculus by the Russians, and if this is indicative of a concerted, concentrated focus against ISIL, as we've said from the very beginning, that is a conversation that we are very willing to have with Russia. And if that's what we're on the cusp of, then there could be opportunities for cooperation. There's no cooperation right now.
And are you able to expand, do you think, the coalition to include Russia and others?
I'm not going to hypothesize now on coalition membership. I think when it gets to cooperation and coordination, the ball really is in Russia's court here in terms of what they're willing to contribute, what they're willing to do against ISIL. But I wouldn't speculate about membership in or out of the coalition. There's a 65-member nation member coalition that's in place, that has been effective, that will continue to be effective against ISIL. And as we've said, we would welcome contributions, meaningful contributions by Russia to that end.
Sorry, isn't Russia doing a lot more against ISIL than a lot of the members of your coalition?
I wouldn't say that, no.
You wouldn't say that Russia's doing more than Andorra right now to defeat the Islamic State.
Every nation contributes what they can. I'm not, wait, Brad, I know where you're going. Look, I'm not gonna, every nation, and it's a coalition of the willing, which means every nation has to be willing to contribute what they can. Not every nation can, for various reasons, participate in airstrikes against ISIL. And so it's a minority of members in the coalition that are actually flying kinetic airstrikes. But that doesn't mean that other nations' contributions aren't important. Some of them are based, some of them are more financial, for instance. But to say that they've had, 1 or 2 days of strikes in Raqqa, that all of a sudden that they're doing more against ISIL than the coalition.
Members. So, not than the coalition, I said than some of the members of the coalition.
I would have to run down the list of what every nation's
Pretty
contributing.
easy.
But those activities, though they may not be as major in terms of airstrikes or resources as every other member, I mean, some nations just don't have the capacity. They have been consistently at it, Brad, and loyally at it. The Russians have just now started to hit a couple of ISIL targets. So let's keep it in perspective.
My point is that can't Russia join your coalition even if it doesn't do all that you want it to do against? I mean, plenty of countries are not doing everything within their power. So why can't Russia join even if it doesn't do everything you want it to do?
You should talk to Russia about their interest in joining the 65-member coalition that exists right now. It's not like there's a signing bonus, okay? And what we've said was, if they show an interest in going after ISIL, there was never any in my statement or anybody's statement that it had to be more airstrikes or airstrikes in this place over that. So it was, if they're willing, as I've said before, if they're willing to make a concerted effort to go after ISIL and they're going to change the calculus of their activities in Syria, then that's a conversation we'd be willing to have. And if those activities are military and they're willing to focus on ISIL, hey, that's great. If they're financial, if they're willing to put the squeeze on ISIL's financing or oil smuggling revenues, we'd be open to having that discussion too.
Right, but what I'm getting at is they are going at, I mean, you're confirming they have hit Raqqa. There are plenty of countries in your coalition who are doing less than that. Do they need? Is it the other things they're doing that prevents them from being in the coalition? So you're saying if they
Yeah, what I said before was every
They
member of the
can't do it.
coalition is focused on the ISIL threat. What we've seen in the recent past by Russia is a focus on the opposition groups and on bolstering the Assad regime. And as we've said, you can't, that is completely inconsistent with the goal of trying to eradicate ISIL in Syria if you're propping up the Assad regime. So
Okay.
it is a
That's-
matter of focus.
That's what
and
I was getting.
perspective.
So you can't be giving support to the Assad regime and fight in your coalition against
We've said
the
that
Islamic
before.
State.
Propping up the Assad regime is a non-starter in terms of contributing to coalition efforts against ISIL.
On this, John, sorry. After Vienna statement, did you see any change in Russian behavior in Syria?
Well, it was after Vienna that they struck al-Raqqa. Now, whether that's a result of Vienna, you'd have to talk to Russian authorities. I don't know what made them, what changed their calculus. But yeah, it was post-Vienna where they struck al-Raqqa.
How would you be convinced that they have changed strategy if this is just
I think you'd have
An
to.
initial
I think
thing.
you'd have to see that over time. And again, we're going to judge actions, not words. And I think you'd have to see, concerted effort over time, not just to go after ISIL, but to stop propping up the Assad regime and allow Assad more opportunities and more capabilities, more freedom, more space to kill his own people and his opposition.
Before I change, can I just get back to this Paris stuff? Today's news on a raid in Paris. Do you have any confirmation that the suspected leader, has been killed?
I don't. I would refer you to French authorities for that. This is their investigation and their operation. Yeah.
Syrian refugee. John, after the Paris attack, there are a lot of discussion here in the United States about the Syrian refugees, and while governors, they refuse to accept Syrian refugees. And yesterday there was U.S. officials on the background. They talked about the screening. But my question is about it's also about the same thing. But today, Dr. Ben Carson, one of the GOP presidential candidate, he said he actually in his OPD to Time, he said, I sent a letter to Senate Majority McConnell and also the Speaker Paul Ryan urging Congress to terminate all public funds for the ongoing federal programs that seek the resettlement for refugees from Syria into the U.S. Is that possible that the Congress can stop the funding for them for this fiscal year?
The refugee program that the State Department administers, I would just say, has benefited over the years by strong bipartisan support. And I would also say that we fervently hope that support will continue. We believe this program is a strong means of demonstrating our commitment to helping the world's most vulnerable, including many that have been persecuted by groups like ISIL. So like all federal programs, it is certainly contingent upon funding from Congress. There's no question about that. It is also contingent on the support of the American people and who we are as a nation and who they are as citizens. But yes, it is a federally funded program that Congress controls the purse for.
Right, but for this fiscal year that you're expecting to get up to 10,000 of Syrian refugees applicants.
We still intend to
You
pursue
already
our
have the
goal.
fund.
Pardon?
You already have the fund for this year, right?
The program's funded for this fiscal year, which just started,
Right.
and nothing's changed about our goal of admitting 10,000.
Have you been able to get any Syrians after you start the program? Because the fiscal year is starting in October, right? It's been it's according
Yeah,
to
I
the
thought I had
numbers
some
you have.
stats in here. I think since October, it's more than 5,000. No, overall more than 5,000. Yeah, but there has been some. I'll have to check. I don't know exactly how many have been admitted since. See, they got 187 since the beginning of the fiscal year.
Okay, so does the Paris attack does that mean that this is gonna continue? But does the Paris attack makes you to increase your screening process for the especially for the Syrians?
Did it make
The
us?
screening process for when you getting them to the United States, it will go through the security procedure. So does the Paris attack became a wake up call for you to increase your screening process and security procedures when you bring Syrians to Iraq?
I'm not aware of any changes to the screening process as a specific result of the Paris attacks. I will tell you, though, that the screening process already is very rigorous for all refugees. And as I've said from this podium before, months ago, that particularly for Syrian refugees, there are added screening procedures put in place because we recognize the potential threat. And we understand that the government's first role is to do what it needs to do to protect and defend our citizens and the American people. And we have always taken the screening process for this program very, very seriously. And in fact, as I said, put additional measures in place specifically for Syrian refugees. Has there been any changes to it since the Paris attacks? I'm not aware of any.
Lastly on that one, when the governors saying that we are not accepting them, is that possible that you are not going to be relocated?
I think Mark handled this before. This is a federal program, and that once the refugees are resettled here in the United States and are going through a legal process towards citizenship, they are protected by the Constitution and they're allowed to move about the country freely. Now, in certain states, there could be state funding issues that might make it harder for them to live in a certain state, but the Constitution protects their ability to move about the country. Obviously, we don't want for a refugee who comes here in good faith to the United States to be in a place where they're not welcome. But they are allowed to move about freely. That's federal law.
Mark, there were a couple reports
John.
today.
Mark's the good-looking one.
There were a couple reports today with one a GOP lawmaker in Tennessee who talked about rounding up refugees who are in his state. Do you have any reaction to that? And then there was a report about a refugee family that was going to go to Indianapolis, but then
Yeah,
it was decided to reroute them to
Yep.
Connecticut.
right.
Can you explain why that was taken?
let me
And
take the
are
second
you
one.
concerned about this becoming a growing trend?
Let me take the second one first. You're right. We know of one refugee family that the resettlement agency, who, as you know, are non-government organizations, made a decision, as is their responsibility, made a decision to reroute them to Connecticut from Indiana because of concerns about their ability to live there in Indiana. And that's what these resettlement agencies are supposed to do. They have to make these final calls, and oftentimes it does come down to, sort of the end game as a family is arriving. So that was a decision we respect. We want this particular family, as we want all the families, to be welcomed and to have an opportunity to live in safety and peace here in the United States. So that was a decision that they made, and again, under the program is their responsibility to make. On your second one, I've seen the reports. I don't know if they're true. Obviously, if they are, this idea of using the National Guard to round up Syrian refugees, deeply troubling, deeply concerning. And as Secretary Kerry, I thought, made very clear today and then in just recent days, certainly not in keeping with the best of American values. And my answer to that would be this, if you don't mind. I'd like to read something. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. George Washington, December 1783. That's who we are.
I had one more. Hold on. I had one
I
more.
was really loud, though. You got my attention.
One last one on the refugee. It's something from yesterday. I asked Mark if he knew of any resettlement because of terrorist sympathies, links, intentions, or other, and he said he didn't know. I was wondering if you got an answer to that.
There have been, I lost my place now. What I can tell you is, yes, there have been some refugees not allowed to settle because of concerns about the potential for terrorist activities. I don't know of any specific Syrians that have been denied that opportunity. That's information that we're not actually able to share with specificity, but I'm not aware of any Syrians that were. But yes, the government screens refugees in a process that's rigorous and deliberate, and we have in fact rejected people from this program for terrorist sympathies or tendencies.
Okay, but with Syrians you haven't that you know of.
I have no information that that any Syrians were rejected. I
Okay.
would add, though, the program has admitted 785,000 refugees in the 14 years since 9/11. Of those, only about a dozen have been arrested or removed from the United States due to terrorism concerns that existed prior to their resettlement in the United States, and I can tell you that none of them were Syrian.
John, to follow up on refugee.
Okay, we'll get it.
Just to clarify,
So is rerouting now or what happened to refugees who are rejected to?
It is not uncommon for rerouting to occur. I mean, even before this incident here in Indiana, because sometimes, those kinds of decisions aren't made until the end game of a refugee's arrival, and sometimes it's based on medical needs. Maybe they need to go somewhere different because of certain medical facilities that aren't available where they originally wanted to settle, or family locations. They want to go to a certain place because they've got a lot of family there. And so some of those decisions aren't made to the end game. So I don't know how common it is, but it's not atypical that decisions made in the end game of a refugee's arrival could change in terms of where they're going to settle. I'm aware of this one case that Brad asked about. I don't think anybody's looking at that as sort of the policy solution. And we don't administer, we don't manage, we don't dictate those decisions. It's done by the resettlement agencies, and based on the best information they have and the best judgment that they can demonstrate in terms of whether it's appropriate and proper and safe, for a refugee family to settle somewhere.
What are other potential scenarios besides rerouting?
What's that?
Other scenarios besides rerouting them to different states? What are other possible things could happen?
What other possible things?
Scenarios.
I don't know. I mean, our job is to do the screening, right? And bring them to this country, and states are informed about the numbers of refugees that are going to be brought into their states. But the decisions about where they go at the very end is not determined until the very end, and the resettlement agency, working with the state coordinator, makes those decisions. But I couldn't lay out for you other different scenarios. Obviously, we want, as I said, we want to uphold our values as an immigrant nation, and we want to see communities around the country, and there's some 180 that routinely welcome refugees, and we want to see that continue. So is it optimal to reroute based on concerns expressed by one or other states? No, that's not. And as the Secretary said, it's not in keeping with who we are as a nation. But we rely and we trust on these resettlement agencies to make those final decisions at the end game.
The humanitarian groups are saying that the actual layer put on the security screening on Syrian refugees is actually a tactic to postpone or to delay the process. I wonder if you have any.
I find it interesting that, just a few weeks ago, if you look at some of the transcripts, it was back in September when that little toddler washed up on that beach, and how the questions I was getting up here and government officials were getting about how slow this is and how we're not doing enough and we have to open up our doors more and we have to speed up the process. And now it's exactly the opposite. Now the questions that we're getting are, well, you got to pause it. You got to stop it. You can't do this. We said back then, and for consistency's sake, I'll say it again today, there's a rigorous screening process in place. We take national security to be a prime responsibility for the United States government. That has never changed. And back when you guys were screaming at us because we weren't doing enough and going fast enough, we said it then. There has to be a balance struck between protecting the national security of the American people and living up to our democratic values. And so the system works the way it works to achieve that balance. You have to do both. You can do both. You must do both as a nation. And we're doing that. Nobody wants to rush to judgment. Nobody wants to rush to failure, obviously. But we also have a responsibility to be an open society. I mean, you want to hand ISIL a great victory? You want to give them what they want? Then shut down refugee resettlement in this country. Make it impossible for people to come here, people that are victims of this violence and brutality themselves. Make it impossible for them to come here. Tell them they're not welcome. Shut them out. And then you give the terrorists the ultimate victory, because that is what they want. They want fear. They want to change. They want to change the way Western societies act and behave and conduct themselves. That is exactly what they're after.
How is that a great victory for us?
I didn't say it was a great victory for.
Look, whether this is completely bonkers or not, the notion of shutting down U.S. resettlement isn't going to affect a whole lot of Syrians. True. I mean, there's 12 million who are uprooted, and you've resettled 2,500. So we're talking about 1 in every 5,000. Mm-hmm. So out of 5,000, 4,999 are completely unaffected by this entire debate, correct? So how is that a great victory for ISIS if this one person, I mean, it may not be very fair or ethical to shut down the program, but that's not going to radically change anything in Syria, is it?
It's absolutely a propaganda value to them. And when we change the way we behave as a nation and fundamentally alter our own characteristics, I mean, I just read you a quote from George Washington. You don't get more American than that. And to change that concept, that principle, I think that would be a great propaganda victory for them. I absolutely do.
That refugee family was rerouted because of concerns for their own security?
I don't know. I'd have to refer you to the resettlement agency who made the decision, but they made the decision based on concerns expressed by authorities there in Indiana, and that's their responsibility to do that.
And how did the call yesterday? Senior administration officials said there was going to be a call with governors and mayors. How did that call go? And did you feel that you're actually convincing them to step back from the position that they're taking?
I think the intent for the call was to provide them the information, and as the secretary said yesterday in Paris, he understands that state government and governors have concerns, that's their responsibility too. He respects that, and that we need to work with the states to answer their concerns and and their questions, and to make sure they understand the very rigorous screening process that goes into place and the value of this program, not just to the United States of America, but to their states when these people settle there and grow and prosper and educate their children there. There's value. So we believe the call was important to provide that context and that perspective. Now, whether it was effective or not, I think you'd have to talk to each and every of the governors that that participated. Obviously, if you look at press reporting today, not all of them were convinced. So maybe there's more spade work to be done to try to allay their concerns and their fears. Everybody shares the same concern, as I said, over national security. But so too must we all share the obligation, the responsibility we have as a democracy to helping those who are the most vulnerable and who are most in need. And that's what this program is about. The great majority of Syrian refugees that have been brought in, and I take Brad's point that the whole numbers may not be high at this point, but 3/4 of them are women and children.
Is there any fear that that this kind of threat against the refugees, like families wanting to, not feeling safe going to a specific area, will dissuade refugees from coming to the United States, that they might elect then rather to go somewhere else?
Certainly hope not.
Have you seen any signs of that yet?
Not yet. I think it's too soon to tell. I mean, we were just a couple of days into this very strident and in some cases hyperbolic reaction to the Paris attacks. So it's too soon to tell, but we certainly hope that's not the case. And I think it just, go back to the Paris attacks. I mean, again, keep it in perspective. So 8 attackers, right? One of which, may have been, no final proof here, may have been a Syrian refugee, one. So I think it's important to keep it in perspective. What's that?
He may be masquerading as a refugee.
And maybe even masquerading. That's why I say may have. We don't know. We don't know. So it's an awful broad, big old brush that they're painting the whole population with, based on these very deadly, terrible attacks.
Are you aware of the reports that 5 Syrian young men have just been arrested in Honduras on fake Greek passports?
I have not. First I've heard of it.
ISO China.
Oh, I got you. Go ahead.
ISO claimed to have executed a Norwegian national and a Chinese hostage. Are you aware of the report? And
We've seen the reports. I'm not in a position to confirm it, and I'd point you to Chinese and Norwegian authorities to speak to this. But if it's true, and I'm not saying that it is, but if it's true, I think it's just yet one more example why this group needs to be defeated.
and what do you make of the conclusion that their execution was a consequence of their government's refusal to pay the ransoms?
Again, I'd point you to Chinese and Norwegian authorities. I can't confirm the veracity of these reports, and I wouldn't speak to causation or anything like that. This is for the Norwegian and the Chinese government to speak to.
It's been the Chinese policy not to send troops to join the fights there. So could you please update us what is the efforts from the United States to persuade China into this U.S.-led coalition to combat ISIL?
I'm not aware of any efforts by the United States to persuade China to contribute militarily to the coalition. It is, as I mentioned to Brad, a coalition of the willing. We're not in the business of cajoling or forcing or trying to convince members to join or to do any specific things in support of the coalition. That's what a coalition of the willing is all about. Everybody has to be willing to participate what they can, where they can, when they can, and with whatever resources they can. And it's been successful as a coalition. 65 nations for the better part of a year, all focused on trying to eliminate this very deadly enemy. China has terrorism concerns as well. And as I said about Russia, I would say about China. If there's, if there's a willingness to contribute against, in efforts against ISIL, well, that's certainly a conversation we'd be willing to have. Yeah, Jenny.
Thank you, John. On North Korea, violations of UNSCR sanctions against North Korea. And in this regard, recently, U.S. Treasury Department has made special sanctions against North Korea. And once North Korea regard arms deal with Myanmar or Burma, we call Myanmar anyway. Do you have any detail of this?
I'm afraid I do not. I'm going to have to take your question.
Okay, thank you. Another one. And recently reported that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will visit North Korea. Maybe.
I'd refer you to the UN. I think that they've denied that report.
Well, I understand that.
I think they've denied that report.
If he visits North Korea, do you think he will be helpful at the denuclearization?
So you want me to speculate on a trip that he hasn't taken?
Yes.
And
maybe he can do.
I can't do that. I can't do
If he visits North Korea.
I'm not going to
If
speculate on the
Big
ramifications of travel.
speculations.
What's that? Please speculate.
Yes. Yeah, will be true.
I've been asked a lot of things before, but I've never
Well,
been asked to speculate
yes.
so directly. I'm not going to do that. I'd refer
Well,
you to.
you can make it true or not true, something.
No, I don't think I can. I don't think I can.
The refugees issue.
Yeah.
One question: why do you rely on the UNHCR to refer refugees to the UN to the U.S. agencies to resettle them in the U.S.?
Because that's the way the program is set up, and that's why the UNHCR exists, to do those referrals. You want there to be, back to when we talked about this in September, when that young toddler showed up on the beach, right? We talked about there's a process here, and the process begins with the UNHCR and their referrals, and our respect of that process. We want our resettlement. You okay? I'm not interrupting anything, am I? No. Tell them I said hi. We want that process to be respected, and we want it to be done through UN auspices. That's the way it should be done.
And to what extent do you trust the work of UNHCR?
Well, look, as I said, 785,000 refugees brought in to this country through the UNHCR auspices, and a dozen or so, only a dozen or so, were sent away because of terrorist concerns. So I think the process works really well. And I think it's also important to keep it in perspective. So as of the end of 2014, the UNHCR was working with nearly 20 million refugees. Of those, because resettlement, as we talked about before, is only one piece of it. Obviously, the main goal here is to get these people to return home and to be able to go back to where they're from. That's what they want in most cases. Less than 1% of that 20 million at the end of 2014, less than 1% were referred for resettlement somewhere else. And of that 1%, 50% of that 1%, so half of that 1%, were resettled here in the United States.
John, can I change the subject to Iran, please? You probably saw today the report on Iran starting to dismantle its nuclear equipment.
Yeah, the IAEA report.
That's correct.
Yeah.
In it says that the stockpiles of low-enriched uranium have increased by 460.2 kilograms in the past 3 months. Why is it going up? Is it not meant to be going down? And is that a violation in any way?
So a couple of things. I'm not going to comment on an IAEA report that hasn't yet been publicly released by the agency. These reports, as you know, are important to track Iran's progress towards meeting its obligations and commitments under the JCPOA. And as I've also said before, we're not going to get to implementation date until the IAEA has confirmed that Iran has met all of its required commitments as specified in the text of the deal. So I'm not going to get into too much detail.
But
there.
you can't explain why that it's gone up.
I'm not going to. I'm not in a position to comment publicly on this particular report. Iran knows what it needs to do to get to implementation day. The report well, I'm not going to comment on the report, but Iran knows what it needs to do to get to implementation, Dave.
You're not concerned by that specific?
I can't comment on the specifics
get
of the report that the IAEA hasn't talked about publicly.
And then on a different subject, something just broke, and I don't know if you knew about it before, but a local 15-day ceasefire between the Syrian rebels and government forces in an area near Damascus is expected to be announced in coming hours. Is this something that you knew about before? Is it true? And what is your reading of such local ceasefires? I mean, that it could be expanded into something.
Well,
something
I haven't seen that report, Leslie, so I'm not in a position to comment on the veracity of it. The ceasefire that, obviously, look, I mean, in a perfect world, there'd be no violence in Syria and there would be no refugees because Syria would be whole and pluralistic and unified and peaceful. And so there'd be no reason for even locally inspired ceasefires. So if there's a ceasefire in place locally and it can hold and people can refrain from killing one another, well, that's a good thing. But I can't confirm those reports. What we're after, because it isn't a perfect world and because Syria is still a chaotic place, a dangerous place and a violent place, what we're after is a UN-sponsored ceasefire, as again, that the Secretary said he's very hopeful can be achieved and sustained in relatively soon. So,
Thank
okay,
you.
everybody, thanks everybody, appreciate it.